I'm Thomas, 43, and I'm calling you from a federal correctional facility where I've been serving time for embezzlement for the past 3 years. I thought my teenage son was handling my absence well. We had our weekly phone calls. He seemed strong, resilient. I believed staying connected would help him through this nightmare I'd created. But last week, I discovered the devastating truth. He had been telling everyone at school, his friends, even his girlfriend's family, that I was dead. My own son would rather be seen as an orphan than admit his father was behind bars. The betrayal cut deeper than any sentence ever could. But what happened when I finally confronted him about this lie would force us both to face a truth we've been running from and change our relationship forever. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family story, like and subscribe for more stories of healing and hope. The truth came to me through the most unlikely source, a crumpled school newsletter that another inmate's sister had brought during visiting hours. She'd been showing her brother pictures of her daughter's high school graduation when I saw it. A memorial section honoring students who had lost parents during their high school years. There, in black and white, was my son's name listed under students who have overcome loss, with a notation that read Father Deceased 2021. I stared at those words until they blurred. Father Deceased. The paper trembled in my hands as the reality sank in. While I'd been counting down the days until my release, planning our reunion, sending him what little money I could from my prison job, my own child had been mourning me like I was already gone. The other inmate's sister noticed my reaction. You. Okay, honey? She asked gently. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the memorial section, then at my son's name. She read it, looked at me with confusion. Then understanding dawned on her face. Oh my God, she whispered. That's your boy? I nodded, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. This woman, a complete stranger, knew something about my son that I didn't. She knew he was grieving a father who was still alive, still breathing, still loving him from behind these concrete walls. That evening, I lay on my narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd learned. Every phone conversation we'd had over the past 3 years played back in my mind like a twisted movie reel. His voice always seemed tired, distant, but I'd attributed that to teenage moodiness and the awkwardness of our situation. Now I understood. He wasn't talking to his father. He was talking to a ghost. The betrayal felt deeper than anything I'd experienced, even deeper than the day I was sentenced. When the judge had declared me guilty, when my wife had filed for divorce, when my business partners had publicly denounced me, none of that compared to this. Those people had reason to turn their backs on me. But my son? I'd loved him unconditionally since the moment he was born. I'd made mistakes, terrible ones, but I'd never stopped being his father. How long had he been carrying this lie? How many times had people offered him sympathy for his loss while I sat in my cell, believing we were maintaining some semblance of connection? The questions multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one more painful than the last. I thought about all the times I'd asked him about school, his friends, his girlfriend. He'd given me vague answers, surface-level responses that I'd accepted because I was grateful for any communication at all. Now I realized he'd been protecting his lie, carefully editing out any details that might reveal the truth of who he really was in his daily life. Not the son of an inmate, but an orphan deserving of pity and special treatment. The worst part was understanding why he'd done it. Even from inside these walls, I knew the stigma that came with having a father in prison. I'd seen how other inmates' families struggled with the shame, how children got bullied at school, how spouses faced judgment in their communities. I told myself that our weekly calls would be enough to maintain our bond, that love could transcend these circumstances. But love, I was learning, couldn't shield a teenager from the cruel realities of social hierarchy and judgment. As I held that newsletter, I realized my son had found a solution to his problem. He'd simply erased me from existence. And the most devastating part of all was that I couldn't even blame him for it. Before everything fell apart, we were the family that other families envied. I keep a photo hidden in my cell, our last Christmas together. All of us gather around the tree in our suburban living room. My son was 15 then, still young. Enough to get excited about presents, but old enough to help me assemble his mother's new exercise bike on Christmas Eve. In that picture, he's wearing the watch I'd given him, a Tag Heuer that cost more than most people made in a month. His smile is genuine, his arm draped casually around my shoulders like I was his hero. I was a financial advisor then, managing portfolios for wealthy clients who trusted me with their life savings. My office overlooked the downtown skyline, and I drove a Mercedes that my son loved to show off to his friends. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in the best school district, took vacations to Europe every summer, and never worried about money. My son played lacrosse at an elite private school where tuition cost more than most people's salaries. I was proud of the life I built for my family, proud that my son would never know the financial struggles I'd faced growing up. But success became a prison of its own. The pressure to maintain our lifestyle, to keep up appearances, to ensure my son never wanted for anything, it consumed me. When the market took a downturn and several of my largest clients threatened to pull their investments, I panicked. I started moving money around, borrowing from one account to cover losses in another, telling myself it was temporary, just until the market recovered, just until I could make everyone whole again. The borrowing became stealing. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. I created false statements, fabricated returns, built an elaborate house of cards that I convinced myself I could maintain indefinitely. I wasn't stealing for personal gain. Every dollar went toward preserving the life my family had grown accustomed to. The private school tuition, the mortgage on our house, the car payments, the vacation fund. I was robbing Peter to pay Paul, except Peter was my client's and Paul was my son's future. That my son never knew how precarious our situation had become. He continued to invite friends over to our house, continued to wear expensive clothes, continued to assume that his father was successful and honorable. When he talked about college, he spoke casually about Ivy League schools, as if the 6-figure tuition was a given. I smiled and nodded, dying inside, knowing that by the time he graduated high school, there might not be any money left for college at all. The scheme unraveled gradually, then all at once. A client requested a large withdrawal just as another. Investment went south. I couldn't cover it, couldn't fabricate the funds, couldn't maintain the illusion any longer. The FBI agents came to my office on a Tuesday morning in March. My son was in his AP calculus class when they arrested his father for embezzling $2.3 million from 17 different clients. I remember thinking, as they put the handcuffs on me, that the worst part wasn't going to be prison. It was going to be telling my son that his hero was actually a criminal. Prison has a way of stripping everything down to the essentials. My days start at 5:30 a.m. with a head count, followed by breakfast in a cafeteria where the scrambled eggs taste like rubber and the coffee could dissolve paint. I work in the prison library now, cataloging books and helping other inmates with their legal research. It pays 47 cents an hour, which means I have to work nearly 3 full days to afford a single phone call to my son. But I've made those calls religiously, every Tuesday at 7 p.m., using the precious minutes I've earned through my labor to hear his voice. I've kept a commissary receipt from every month for the past 3 years, evidence of the money I've sent him, scraped together from my meager prison wages and the occasional funds from selling my legal expertise to other inmates. $25 here, $50 there. It wasn't much, but it was everything I had. I shared a cell with Marcus, a lifer who'd been in for armed robbery since before my son was born. Marcus had 3 daughters he'd never seen outside of a visiting room, and he became my unofficial mentor and the art of fathering from behind bars. He taught me how to make the weekly phone calls count, how to send meaningful letters, how to stay connected to a world that wanted to forget we existed. The key, Marcus would tell me during our late-night conversations, is consistency. You show up every week, same day, same time. You become the most reliable thing in their life, even from in here. Eventually, they start to depend on that consistency. I followed his advice religiously. Every Tuesday, 7 p.m. sharp, I'd call my son. We'd talk about school, his lacrosse season, his part-time job at a local restaurant. The conversations were often stilted, awkward, but I treasured every minute. When he made varsity lacrosse, I was the first person he called. When he got his driver's license, he told me about it during our next scheduled conversation. I thought we were building something, maintaining the foundation of our relationship despite the concrete and steel between us. Other inmates would share stories about their children during our group therapy sessions. Rodriguez had a son who visited every month without fail, bringing grandchildren Marcus had helped raise through collect calls and letters. Thompson's daughter had written him off completely, returning his letters unopened. I considered herself lucky my son still took my calls, still seemed to care about staying connected. Now I realize how naive I was. While I was congratulating myself on being a present father despite my circumstances, my son was living a completely different reality. The money I sent him probably went toward maintaining whatever story he'd constructed about where his income was coming from. The conversations we shared were likely torture for him, forced interactions with a man he'd already buried in his public life. The cruelest irony is that I'd been proud of our relationship. In a place where most men had lost their families entirely, I thought I was one of the success stories. For 3 days after seeing that newsletter, I couldn't eat. I sat in my cell with a yellow legal pad, writing and rewriting what I wanted to say to my son. The pages were covered with crossed-out sentences, false starts, and angry words that I'd immediately regretted putting on paper. My first instinct was rage. How dare he erase me? How dare he take my love, my money, my weekly calls, while telling the world I was dead? I wrote furious paragraphs about betrayal and ingratitude, about how I'd sacrificed everything for him, about how his lies were a slap in the face to everything I'd tried to preserve of our relationship. But as I sat there staring at those angry words, I realized they sounded exactly like the kind of father who deserved to be declared dead. This wasn't about me and my hurt feelings. This was about a teenager who'd been so ashamed of his father that he'd invented an elaborate lie to escape the stigma. If I came at him with accusations and demands, I'd prove that his instincts about me were correct. I sought advice from Dr. Patricia Coleman, the prison psychologist who ran our weekly group therapy sessions. She was a small woman with kind eyes who'd spent 15 years helping inmates navigate family relationships from behind bars. When I told her about my discovery, she didn't seem surprised. "Thomas," she said gently, "what do you think your son was trying to protect by creating this story?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't considered what my son was protecting. His reputation, I guess. His social standing. "Maybe," she said. "But what else? What deeper need might this lie be serving?" I thought about it for days. My son wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was protecting his right to exist as a normal teenager, to date a girl whose parents didn't look at him with pity or suspicion, to apply for jobs without having to explain his family situation, to participate in school activities without teachers treating him like a victim or a potential problem. Marcus helped me understand the practical implications. "Kids probably applying to colleges soon, right?" he asked one evening. "You think having a felon for a father helps or hurts his chances?" The weight of that reality settled on me like a heavy blanket. My son wasn't just dealing with teenage embarrassment. He was making strategic decisions about his future. Every scholarship application, every college interview, Every job opportunity could be affected by his association with me. By declaring me dead, he wasn't just protecting his present. He was protecting his entire future. I rewrote my approach completely. Instead of confronting him about the lie, I would ask him about his life. Really ask. I would listen for the things he wasn't telling me, the struggles he was facing that I'd been too self-absorbed to notice. I would create space for him to tell me the truth on his own terms. When he was ready, the script I finally settled on was simple. Son, I love you, and I want to understand what you're going through. Help me be the father you need, even from in here. Tuesday came like a death sentence. I'd been rehearsing my words for days, but when I picked up that phone and heard his familiar, "Hey, Dad," my carefully planned script crumbled. There was something in his voice, a weariness I'd never noticed before, like he was bracing himself for another performance. "Hey, son," I managed, my voice rougher than usual. "How was your week?" "Fine," he said, the same one-word answer he'd been giving me for months. "Lacrosse practice has been intense. Coach thinks we might make it to regionals this year." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Even now, knowing what I knew, he was maintaining the facade, feeding me details about a life he'd constructed, a world where he was just a normal kid with normal problems. "That's great," I said, then took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Listen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." The pause on his end. So long I thought the call had been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, younger somehow. "Okay, I saw a school newsletter last week," I said carefully. "It mentioned students who'd lost parents. Your name was on that list." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him calculating responses, weighing options, deciding how much of the truth he could afford to tell. "Dad, he started, then stopped. "I can explain." "I'm not angry," I said quickly, though that wasn't entirely true. "I just want to understand. Help me understand what's been going on." Another pause. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it, it was easier. Easier than what? Easier than explaining. His voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what it's like to have people look at you differently when they find out your dad is in prison? Do you know what it's like to watch their faces change, to see them wondering what kind of person you must be if your own father is a criminal?" The words hit me like physical blows. Each syllable contained years of pain I'd been blind to, shame I'd forced him to carry alone. "So I told him you were dead," he continued, gaining momentum now that the secret was out. "And you know what? People were nice to me. They offered sympathy instead of judgment. They treated me like a victim instead of like I was guilty by association. I wanted to argue, to tell him that he shouldn't care what other people thought, that he should be proud of the father who loved him regardless of his mistakes. But the words died in my throat because I knew he was right. I knew exactly what those looks felt like because I'd experienced them myself from former friends, business associates, neighbors who'd once respected me. "Why did you start telling people this?" I asked. "The beginning of sophomore year," he admitted. "Right after you were sentenced. I was tired of being the kid whose dad was a thief. I just wanted to be normal." I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a letter I'd written but never sent, filled with all the hurt and anger I'd initially felt about his lie. Looking at it now, those words seemed selfish and small. "Have you told anyone the truth?" I asked. "No," he said. "I'm not going to. This conversation doesn't change anything, Dad. I'm still not going to tell people you're alive, because nothing has changed. You're still in prison. I'm still the son of a criminal. The only difference is now you know that I know how much that sucks." The floodgates had opened, and 3 years of suppressed anger came pouring out. My son's voice grew stronger, more certain, as he finally gave voice to everything he'd been carrying alone. Do you want to know what my junior year was like? He asked, not waiting for an answer. I had to figure out how to pay for my lacrosse equipment because Mom said we couldn't afford it anymore. I had to get a job at Romano's Pizzeria, working nights and weekends, telling everyone the money was for college savings, when really it was just to help keep us afloat. I thought about the graduation program I'd never seen, the award ceremonies I'd missed, the milestones I'd only heard about secondhand through our stilted phone conversations. While I'd been congratulating myself on staying connected, he'd been navigating major life changes completely alone. The hardest part wasn't even the money, he continued. It was watching Mom cry herself to sleep every night for the first year. It was seeing her have to get a job at the grocery store after being a stay-at-home mom for 15 years. It was watching our neighbors whisper when we walked by, watching our old friends suddenly become too busy to return phone calls. Each word was a revelation and a condemnation. I'd been so focused on my own suffering, my own loss, that I'd failed to consider the ripple effects of my choices. My son hadn't just lost his father, he'd lost his entire world. But the worst part, he said, his voice growing quieter again, was realizing that everything I thought I knew about you was a lie. You weren't a successful businessman, you were a thief. You weren't providing for our family, you were stealing from other families to keep up appearances. Do you know how that felt? Finding out that my hero was actually the villain in someone else's story? I wanted to defend myself, too. Explain that I'd been trying to protect them, that every dollar I'd stolen had gone toward preserving their lifestyle. But I realized how hollow that defense sounded. I hadn't been protecting them. I'd been protecting myself from having to admit failure, from having to scale back our lifestyle, from having to tell my son that Daddy couldn't afford all the things he'd grown accustomed to. The day you were arrested, he continued, I was in calculus class. Mrs. Henderson called me to the principal's office, and I thought maybe I was in trouble for something. Instead, there were 2 FBI agents waiting to tell me that my father had been charged with embezzlement. They were actually nice about it, professional. They explained that I wasn't in any trouble, that this was just a courtesy notification because it would probably be in the news. I closed my eyes, imagining my 16-year-old son sitting in that office, his world collapsing around him while adults spoke in careful, measured tones about federal charges and restitution. I went back to class afterward. He said, just sat there pretending to pay attention to derivatives and integrals while my phone buzzed with texts from friends who'd seen the news. By the end of the day, everyone knew. The whispers started immediately. That's the kid whose dad stole all that money. I heard his family's broke now. My mom says we're not allowed to hang out with him anymore. The picture he was painting was devastating. While I'd been processing my own shame and fear in county jail, my son had been facing the social and emotional consequences of my choices in the cruel ecosystem of high school. So when I started at Jefferson High the next year, he said, I decided to start fresh. New school, new story. When people asked about my family, I told them my dad had died in a car accident when I was younger. Suddenly, instead of being the criminal son, I was the brave kid who'd overcome tragedy. Teachers cut me slack. Other parents invited me over for dinner. Girls actually wanted to date me instead of worrying about what their families would think. As my son continued talking, the full scope of his deception became clear. This wasn't just a casual lie he'd told a few people. It was an entirely constructed identity he'd been maintaining for over 2 years. I had to make a fake death certificate, he admitted, his voice carrying a mixture of shame and pride. For the school records. I found a template online and filled in your information. Made it look official enough that the guidance counselor wouldn't ask too many questions. I told them I was living with Mom and that we were still processing our grief, so please don't push for too many details. The image of my 17-year-old son hunched over a computer, carefully crafting evidence of my death, was almost too painful to bear. But I forced myself to listen, to understand the lengths he'd gone to in order to escape the reality I'd created for him. The hardest part was remembering what I'd told to whom, he continued. I had to keep track of which version of the story I'd shared with different people. Some people thought you died in a car accident. Others heard it was cancer. My English teacher thinks you were killed overseas in some kind of consulting work. I had to write it all down just to keep the stories straight. I thought about all the sympathy he'd received under false pretenses, all the special treatment based on a lie. But I also thought about the psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception. My son had essentially been living a double life, constantly vigilant about maintaining his cover story, while secretly speaking to his dead father every Tuesday night. "What about your girlfriend?" I asked. "The one you mentioned a few months ago?" His pause told me everything I needed to know before he answered. "Riley believes you died when I was 14. Her parents have been incredibly kind to me because of it. They invite me to family dinners, include me in their holiday celebrations. Her dad even offered to help me with college applications because he thought I didn't have a father figure." The cruelty of that irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been trying to maintain some kind of paternal relationship through weekly phone calls, another man had been stepping into the role I'd vacated, offering my son guidance and support based on the belief that I was dead. "Our family loves me," he said, and I could hear both gratitude and guilt in his voice. "They treat me like their own son. Riley's mom makes me care packages for school, just like she does for Riley. They came to my lacrosse games when Mom had to work. They've been more of a family to me than—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air between. "Less than your real family," I finished for him. "You're not my real family anymore, Dad," he said quietly. "Real families don't abandon each other. Real fathers don't destroy their children's lives to cover up their own mistakes." The words cut deep, but I couldn't argue with them. I had abandoned him in the most fundamental way possible. Not physically, I called every week, sent what money I could, but emotionally and practically. I'd left him to navigate the consequences of my actions alone while I dealt with my own problems. The scholarship applications were the worst part. He continued, "Do you know how many forms ask about family income, family background, parents' education, and employment? I had to create an entire fictional history for you. I said you'd been a marketing consultant who died without life insurance, leaving us struggling financially. It explained why we needed financial aid without making me look like a charity case. I realized then that my son hadn't just been hiding from social embarrassment. He'd been protecting his entire future. College admissions, job applications, security clearances, all of these could be affected by having a father with a criminal record. By killing me off on paper, he'd been trying to give himself a clean slate. What does your mother think about all this?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. My ex-wife and I hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized. All our communication went through lawyers, and even that had dwindled to nothing over the past year. My son's laugh was bitter. "Mom doesn't know about the lie. She thinks I'm just private about family stuff at school. She's been so wrapped up in her own problems that she hasn't really paid attention to what I've been telling people." The picture he painted of his mother broke my heart almost as much as his own story. My ex-wife had been a stay-at-home mom for 15 years, completely dependent on my income, utterly unprepared for the reality of supporting herself and our son alone. When I was arrested, she didn't just lose her husband, she lost her entire identity. "She cries a lot," he said matter-of-factly, "usually at night when she thinks I can't hear her. She got a job at Miller's grocery store, working the night shift because it pays 50 cents more per hour. Sometimes I hear her on the phone with her sister, talking about how embarrassed she is, how she can't show her face at church anymore, how all her friends have basically abandoned her. I pulled out the divorce papers from my small collection of personal belongings, papers I'd kept not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of everything I'd lost. The decree had been swift and decisive. My ex-wife had wanted nothing more than to legally separate herself from me and my crimes as quickly as possible. I couldn't blame her for that, but I hadn't considered how completely it would isolate her from the support system she'd relied on for decades. She talks about you sometimes, my son continued, usually when she's really angry or really sad. She say things like, "Your father destroyed our lives," or "We'll never be able to trust anyone again because of what he did." She's not wrong, but it doesn't make it easier to hear. The weight of generational damage settled on me like a crushing force. I hadn't just hurt my direct victims, the clients whose money I'd stolen. I hadn't just hurt myself. I'd created a ripple effect of pain that had touched every aspect of my family's life, changing them in ways I was only beginning to understand. "The worst part is watching her blame herself," he said. "She keeps saying she should have known, should have seen the signs, should have stopped you somehow. She's convinced that everyone thinks she was complicit, that she knew about the money and just looked the other way. She won't even go to the grocery store during busy hours because she's afraid of running into people we used to know." I thought about the woman I'd married, confident and social, the kind of person who organized neighborhood block parties and volunteered at school fundraisers. The isolation my son was describing sounded like a form of living death, a punishment she didn't deserve for crimes she'd had no part in. "She doesn't date," he added. "Hasn't even tried. She says no decent man would want to be associated with our family, that she's damaged goods now. She's 41 years old, and she's convinced her life is basically over." The full scope of what I'd destroyed was becoming clearer with every word. I'd been so focused on my own loss, my freedom, my reputation, my relationship with my son, that I'd failed to consider how my choices had rewritten the entire trajectory of their lives. My ex-wife hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost her social circle, her financial security, her sense of self-worth, and her hope for the future. My son hadn't just lost a father. He'd lost his childhood, his innocence, and his right to a normal adolescence. The conversation with my son had opened a window into a world of consequences I'd never fully grasped. Over the following days, I found myself thinking obsessively about the medical records he'd mentioned in passing therapy sessions I'd never known about, anxiety medication I'd never been told he was taking. "You said you've been seeing a counselor," I brought up during our next call. "How long has that been going on?" "Since junior year," he said. "Right after I started the new school. I was having panic attacks, couldn't sleep. Mom found me having a breakdown in my room one night and finally took me to see someone. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach." While I'd been congratulating myself on our regular phone calls, my son had been suffering from clinical anxiety severe enough to require professional intervention. "The panic attacks were the worst part," he continued. "They'd come out of nowhere. Usually when someone would ask about my family, or when I had to fill out forms that asked for parent information. My hands would shake. I couldn't breathe. I'd have to excuse myself and go to the bathroom until it passed." The image of my teenage son hyperventilating in a school bathroom, alone and terrified that his carefully constructed lie might be discovered, was almost unbearable. I'd created a situation where my own child lived in constant fear of exposure, where normal social interactions had become landmines. Dr. Patterson, that's my therapist, she helped me understand that I was living with something called complicated grief. He explained, except instead of grieving someone who actually died, I was grieving the father I thought I had, the life I thought we were living. She said it was normal to feel angry and betrayed, but that I needed to find healthier ways to cope than creating elaborate lies. "Did you tell her the truth?" I asked. "Not at first. For the first few months, I kept up the story about you being dead, But she's smart, and she started asking questions that didn't add up. Finally, I broke down and told her everything about your crimes, about the shame, about the lie I'd been living. I was surprised by how relieved I felt to know that at least one adult in his life knew the full truth of his situation. What did she say? She didn't judge me for the lie, he said. She said it was a survival mechanism, a way of protecting myself from trauma I wasn't equipped to handle. But she also helped me see how much energy I was spending on maintaining the deception, and how that energy could be better used on healing and moving forward. The conversation revealed layer after layer of damage I'd never considered. My son told me about how he'd had to decline invitations to friends' houses because their parents might ask too many questions about our family. He'd given up on his dreams of running for student council because campaigns required family involvement. He'd avoided school plays and academic competitions that would put him in the spotlight, afraid that increased attention might lead to someone discovering the truth. Even dating has been complicated, he admitted. Every relationship I've had has been built on a fundamental lie. Do you know how that feels? I've never been able to be completely honest with someone I cared about. There's always this voice in my head wondering what they'd think if they knew the truth about my family. I thought about Riley, the girlfriend whose family had essentially adopted him based on their sympathy for his supposed loss. The kindness they'd shown him was genuine, but it was also conditional based on a story that painted him as a victim rather than the son of a perpetrator. Our family has been so good to me, he said, echoing my thoughts. They've helped me with college applications, taken me on family vacations, included me in holiday celebrations. Riley's dad taught me to drive stick shift and helped me change my first tire. They've given me experiences I never would have had otherwise. But, I prompted, hearing the conflict in his voice. But it's all based on a lie, he finished. Every act of kindness, every moment of inclusion, it's all predicated on them believing I'm an orphan who deserves their sympathy. What happens when they find out the truth? That I'm not a tragic figure who lost his father too young, but the son of a criminal who chose to create an elaborate deception rather than deal with reality? After that devastating phone call, I threw myself into the prison's family therapy group with a desperation I'd never felt before. Dr. Coleman ran these sessions every Thursday evening in a sterile conference room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The group consisted of 8 men, all struggling to maintain relationships with families on the outside. I brought my notebook from the group sessions pages, filled with insights from men who'd been where I was, who'd made the same mistakes I was making. Marcus had been attending these sessions for 12 years, and his perspective had evolved far beyond my own limited understanding. The first thing you got to accept, Marcus told the group during one particularly intense session, is that your kid don't owe you nothing. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even contact. Everything you get from here on out is a gift, not a right. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. His son had been visiting faithfully for 8 years, but it had taken 3 years of complete silence before that first visit happened. I spent those 3 years writing letters he never answered, sending birthday cards that got returned unopened. I was so focused on what I needed, his forgiveness, his love, that I never stopped to think about what he needed. What did he need? I asked. Time, Rodriguez said simply. Time to be angry. Time to grieve. Time to figure out who he was without his father around. Time to hate me, if that's what it took for him to heal. Thompson's story was different, but equally instructive. His daughter had maintained a relationship with him throughout his incarceration, but it wasn't until she was an adult that she revealed the full cost of his crimes on her life. Like my son, she'd faced social stigma, financial hardship, and the complex trauma of loving someone who'd betrayed everything she believed about him. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't that I was a drug dealer, Thompson shared. It was that I'd lied to her about who I was for her entire childhood. She thought she knew her father, and then she found out that person had never really existed. The parallel to my own situation was uncomfortable and exact. My son was grieving not just the loss of his father, but the discovery that the father he'd known had been, in many ways, a fiction. Dr. Coleman helped us understand that our children's responses to our incarceration weren't just about shame or embarrassment. They were about survival. Your son created a narrative that allowed him to function in his daily life. She explained after I'd shared my story with the group. That narrative may be painful for you, but it's serving a crucial psychological function for him. But he's living a lie, I protested. He's living a truth, she corrected gently. Maybe not a factual truth, but an emotional truth. The truth that the father he thought he knew is gone. The truth that the life he thought he was living was built on deception. In some ways, his story about your death is more honest than the story you were telling yourself about maintaining a normal father-son relationship from prison. That observation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so proud of our weekly calls, so convinced that I was being a good father despite my circumstances. But I was the one living in denial, pretending that love alone could bridge the gap between us, when the reality was that my son was drowning in consequences I'd never bothered to fully acknowledge. The following Tuesday, I approached our phone call with a completely different mindset. I'd spent the week processing everything the therapy group had taught me. I'd come to some painful realizations about my own role in perpetuating my son's suffering. When he answered the phone, I could hear the wariness in his voice. Our previous conversation had changed something between us. We'd crossed a line from which there was no going back. "Hey, Dad," he said, but the greeting lacked even the minimal warmth it had carried before. "Son, I've been thinking about everything you told me last week," I began, "and I owe you an apology. Not for the crime, I've apologized for that 100 times, but for something I never even realized I was doing." He didn't respond, but I could hear him breathing, waiting. "I'd been calling you every week for 3 years, thinking I was being a good father, thinking I was maintaining our relationship. But I never once asked you what you needed from me. I never asked if these calls were helping you or hurting you. I never considered that staying connected to me might be making your life harder instead of easier." The visitor log from the past 3 years told its own story. My son's name appeared exactly 0 times. In 3 years of incarceration, he had never once come to see me. I told myself it was because visits were difficult to arrange, because he was busy with school and work. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He didn't want to see me. I looked at the visitor log. I continued, "You've never come to see me. Not once. And I never asked you why, because I was afraid of the answer. But I'm asking now. What would it take for you to want to have a relationship with me? What would I need to do differently?" The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "You want to know what would make a difference?" he asked. "Stop pretending like everything's okay. Stop acting like our weekly phone calls mean we have a relationship. Stop sending me money I can't explain to anyone. Stop expecting me to be grateful for a connection that makes every other part of my life more complicated." Each word was a necessary cruelty, a surgical removal of the illusions I'd been clinging to. "You want to help me?" he continued. "Then help me figure out how to live with the consequences of what you did. Help me understand how to move forward instead of just trying to maintain something that was broken before you ever got to prison." I took a shaky breath. "What does that look like?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But it starts with you accepting that the son you're talking to every week isn't the same person I am in my real life. The person I am with my friends, with Riley's family, at school, that person exists because I've had to become someone different to survive what you did to our family." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. and it cut deeper than any accusation ever could. My son had essentially created two separate identities: the dutiful son who took my calls and pretended we had a relationship, and the resilient young man who'd built a life despite his circumstances. "I've been thinking about telling Riley the truth," he said suddenly. "Dr. Patterson thinks it might be helpful. That carrying this secret is causing more damage than revealing it would." My heart raced. "What's holding you back?" "Fear," he said simply. "Fear that she'd leave. Fear that her family will stop treating me like their own son. Fear that I'll lose the only normal family relationship I have left." I understood then that my son was facing the same choice I'd faced 3 years ago when my crimes were discovered. He could continue living a lie that was slowly destroying him from the inside, or he could face the consequences of the truth and try to build something real from the wreckage. "What if she doesn't leave?" I asked. "What if her family surprises you? Then I'll have to figure out how to live as someone whose father is in prison instead of someone whose father is dead," he said. "And honestly, Dad, I don't know if I remember how to do that anymore." Over the next few weeks, our conversations took on a different quality. Instead of the surface-level updates about school and lacrosse, my son began sharing the real details of his internal struggle with living a double life. He told me about the social media posts he'd crafted carefully over the years, images and captions that supported his narrative without explicitly mentioning me. "Look at this," he said during one call, and I could hear him scrolling through his phone. I'd posted a picture from last Father's Day. It's just me and Riley at the beach, but the caption says, "Grateful for father figures who step up when it matters most." Everyone assumed I was talking about Riley's dad, and I let them think that. Each post was a masterpiece of careful ambiguity, designed to maintain his story without outright lying in ways that could be easily disproven. He'd become an expert at deflection, at steering conversations away from family topics, at maintaining just enough mystery about his background that people filled in the gaps with their own assumptions. "The hardest part is with Riley's family," he continued. "They've been so good to me, but sometimes I catch them looking at me with this mixture of pity and admiration. Like I'm this brave survivor who's overcome such tragedy." Last month, Riley's mom told her friends that I was the strongest young man she'd ever met, that I was an inspiration for how I'd handled losing my father so young. I could hear the guilt in his voice, the weight of accepting praise for resilience in overcoming a loss that had never actually occurred. The psychological burden of maintaining such an elaborate deception was becoming clear. Every compliment about his strength was a reminder of his dishonesty. Every expression of sympathy was salt in the wound of his conscience. "Our dad wants to help me with college applications," he said. "He's been researching scholarships for students who've lost parents, talking about how my unique perspective on loss could make my essays stand out. He spent his own money to hire a college consultant to help me because he said every kid deserves to have a father's support in this process." The irony was devastating. While I sat in prison, another man was stepping into the paternal role I'd abdicated, offering my son guidance and support based on the belief that I was no longer in the picture. That man's kindness was genuine, but it was also predicated on a fundamental deception that made every gesture of care feel like a betrayal to my son. "What happens when you tell them the truth?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Best case scenario, they're understanding and supportive, and nothing really changes except that they know the truth. Worst case scenario, they feel betrayed and manipulated, and I lose the only stable family relationship I have." I thought about the screenshots he'd mentioned, years of carefully curated social media presence, designed to support his narrative. Every birthday post, every family gathering photo, every milestone celebration had been filtered through the lens of his deception. Revealing the truth wouldn't just require one difficult conversation. It would require recontextualizing years of shared experiences. explaining away inconsistencies and risking the loss of relationships that had become central to his identity. There's another possibility, I said carefully. What if the truth actually brings you closer to them? What if they respect your honesty and understand why you felt you needed to protect yourself? Maybe, he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Or maybe they'll wonder what else I've lied about. Maybe. They'll question whether any of our relationship has been real, or if I've just been manipulating them for sympathy and support. That fear cut to the heart of his dilemma. My son hadn't just been lying about my status. He'd been accepting love, support, and resources under false pretenses. The guilt of that deception was eating away at him, but the fear of losing what he'd gained made confession seem impossible. I've been thinking about the other kids at school who might be going through something similar, he said. Not necessarily lying about dead parents, but hiding family problems, pretending everything's fine when it's not. I wonder how many of us are walking around with these huge secrets, afraid that the truth would make people see us differently. The observation revealed how much his perspective had matured through this ordeal. He was beginning to see his situation not as a unique moral failing, but as part of a broader pattern of how shame and stigma force people into deception as a survival mechanism. Difficult conversation. It would require recontextualizing years of shared experiences. There's another possibility, I said carefully. What if the truth actually brings you closer to them? What if they respect your honesty and understand why you felt you needed to protect yourself? Maybe, he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Or maybe they'll wonder what else I've lied about. Maybe they'll question whether any of our relationship has been real, or if I've just been manipulating them for sympathy and support. That fear cut to the heart of his dilemma. My son hadn't just been lying about my status. He'd been accepting love, support, and resources under false pretenses. The guilt of that deception was eating away at him, but the fear of losing what he'd gained made confession seem impossible. 3 weeks after our breakthrough conversation, my son called me on a Saturday outside our usual Tuesday schedule. His voice was shaky, nervous in a way I hadn't heard since he was a little boy calling to tell me he'd broken something valuable. Dad, I did it, he said without preamble. I told Riley the truth. My heart stopped. How did it go? Better than I expected, he said, and I could hear a mixture of relief and disbelief in his voice. Worse than I hoped. Different than I imagined. He told me about the conversation that had taken place in Riley's car after a movie, parked in the lot behind the theater where they'd had their first date 2 years ago. He'd been planning to tell her for weeks, rehearsing different versions of the truth, trying to find words that would minimize the damage while still being completely honest. I started by apologizing, he said. I told her I'd been lying about something important, and that I needed her to hear the truth from me before she heard it from someone else. She got really quiet, really serious. I think she was expecting me to confess to cheating or something. The letter Riley had written him afterward, which he read to me over the phone, revealed the depth of her character in ways that surprised both of us. Instead of anger or betrayal, her response had been curiosity and concern. She'd written about how she'd always sensed there was something he wasn't telling her, but had assumed it was just the natural grief of someone who'd lost a parent young. She asked me why I felt like I needed to lie to her, he continued. Not in an accusatory way, but like she genuinely wanted to understand what I'd been going through. When I explained about the shame, about how differently people treat you when they know your father is a criminal, she just nodded like it made perfect sense. Riley's reaction had been more nuanced than the simple acceptance or rejection he'd feared. She was hurt that he hadn't trusted her with the truth, but she understood why he'd felt the need to protect himself. She was worried about how the revelation would affect their relationship. But she was also relieved to finally understand some of the inconsistencies she'd noticed in his stories over the years. She said she'd always wondered why I never talked about you in detail, he explained. Like, I could tell her about my childhood, about family traditions and memories, but whenever she asked specific questions about what you were like as a person, I'd get vague and change the subject. She thought maybe it was just too painful to talk about. In some ways, Riley had been living with her own version of the lie, filling in gaps with her imagination, creating a mental picture of the father I'd supposedly been based on the limited information my son had provided. Learning that I was alive but incarcerated required her to completely reconstruct her understanding of his family situation. The hardest part was explaining why I'd accepted so much help from her family under false pretenses. He said, all those dinners, all the college planning, all the emotional support, it was all based on them thinking I was an orphan who needed their help. Riley understood that I hadn't set out to manipulate anyone, but she also helped me see how the deception had affected her family's relationship with me. Riley had asked for time to process the information before deciding how to move forward. She hadn't broken up with him, but she hadn't offered immediate forgiveness either. She'd requested honesty about everything else. No more secrets, no more carefully edited truths. She wanted to know about our phone calls, about the money I'd been sending, about his therapy sessions and panic attacks. She wants to know about you, he said, and his voice carried a note of wonder. Not just the fact that you exist, but what you're like as a person. She asked if I thought you were a good father before you went to prison, whether I missed you, whether I thought you deserved forgiveness. What did you tell her? The truth, he said. That it's complicated, that I love you and hate what you did at the same time. That I miss the father I thought you were, but I'm not sure how I feel about the father you actually are. The conversation had lasted 3 hours, with Riley asking thoughtful questions, and my son finally having the opportunity to be completely honest with someone about his situation. For the first time in years, he'd been able to talk about the complexity of his feelings without having to maintain any pretense or protect anyone's feelings. She told me something interesting, he continued. She said that she'd always felt like there was a wall between us, like I was holding back parts of myself. She thought it was just because I was naturally private, but now she realizes it was because I couldn't be completely authentic while maintaining such a big lie. The relief in his voice was palpable. After years of careful compartmentalization, he'd finally been able to integrate the different aspects of his identity with someone who mattered to him. Riley's acceptance gave my son the courage he needed to take the next step. 2 weeks after their conversation, he made an appointment with his school counselor to correct the record officially. The school counselor's report, which he described to me in detail, revealed how thoroughly his deception had affected his educational experience. Mrs. Rodriguez was shocked, he told me during our next call. She'd been treating me as a bereaved student for 2.5 years. She'd given me extensions on assignments, recommended me for grief counseling, even nominated me for a scholarship specifically for students who'd lost parents. The conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez had been awkward but ultimately productive. She'd helped him understand that his deception, while understandable, had consequences that went beyond his personal relationships. The scholarship nomination would need to be withdrawn. His college applications, many of which had been built around the narrative of overcoming parental loss, would need to be reconsidered. But she also helped me see that I had a different story to tell, he continued. Instead of being the kid who lost his father to death, I could be the kid who lost his father to his own poor choices and learned to build a life anyway. She said, that took a different kind of strength, and that colleges might actually find that story more compelling because it's about active resilience rather than passive victimhood. The process of telling the truth at school had been surprisingly liberating for my son. Instead of the social catastrophe he'd feared, He'd found that many of his classmates had their own family complications they'd been hiding. The captain of the debate team had a mother in rehab. The valedictorian's father had been unemployed for 2 years. The star quarterback's parents were getting divorced after his father's affair came to light. It turns out that perfect families are rarer than I thought, he said. Once I stopped pretending to have one, other people started being honest about their own situations. It's like my lie had been preventing real connections because I couldn't be authentic about my own experiences. His teachers had responded with a mixture of surprise and support. Some admitted they'd always wondered about inconsistencies in his story, but hadn't wanted to push him to talk about something they assumed was traumatic. Others said they were impressed by his decision to come forward voluntarily, that it showed maturity and integrity. The weird thing is, I feel more proud of myself now than I did when people thought I was this tragic figure who'd overcome so much, he explained. Before, people were impressed by something that hadn't actually happened to me. Now, they're impressed by something I actually did, making the choice to stop living a lie and deal with reality instead. The revelation had also changed his relationship with his academic work. He'd been accepted to 3 state universities, based partially on essays about overcoming loss and adversity. Now he was rewriting those essays to tell the truth about his experience, the shame, the anger, the complex process of loving someone who'd betrayed your trust. My new essay is about learning the difference between shame and responsibility, he told me. About how I'm not responsible for your crimes, but I am responsible for how I choose to respond to them. About how hiding from the truth was understandable, but ultimately self-defeating. The response from his classmates had been overwhelmingly positive. Instead of the judgment and rejection he'd feared, he'd found acceptance and even admiration for his honesty. Several friends admitted they'd always felt like they couldn't really know him because he was so guarded about family topics. Now those relationships were deepening in ways he hadn't expected. I wish I'd done this sooner, he admitted. I wasted so much energy maintaining the lie, energy I could have used to actually heal from what happened to our family. The most surprising development had been the response from Riley's parents. When she finally told them the truth about my situation, their reaction had been thoughtful rather than angry. They'd asked questions about my son's well-being, expressed concern about the burden he'd been carrying, and reaffirmed their commitment to supporting him regardless of his family circumstances. They said they understood why I felt I needed to protect myself, he said, wonder in his voice. Riley's dad told me that knowing the truth actually made him respect me more, not less. He said it took real strength to carry that secret for so long, and even more strength to finally tell the truth. The conversation with Riley's parents had lasted well into the evening, with them asking thoughtful questions about his experience and sharing their own perspectives on family challenges and resilience. They'd admitted that they'd always sensed something was missing from his story, but had attributed it to the natural reticence of someone processing grief. Riley's mom cried when I told her about the panic attacks, he continued. She said she wished she'd known so she could have helped me through them. She asked if there were other ways they could support me now that they knew the whole story. The family had also expressed curiosity about Mon, not judgment, but genuine interest in understanding the full picture of his family situation. They'd asked about my crime, my sentence, and my relationship with my son, approaching the topic with sensitivity and without making assumptions about my character based solely on my legal troubles. They want to write you a letter, he said. Riley's dad said he'd like to tell you how proud you should be of the son you raised, despite everything that's happened. He said that my character and integrity had to come from somewhere, and that, even though you made terrible mistakes, you must have done something right as a father before that. The generosity of that gesture overwhelmed me. These people had every reason to distance themselves from our family's complications, but instead, they were choosing empathy and understanding. The breakthrough came during our first video call in 3 years. The prison had recently upgraded their communication system, and my son had finally agreed to see my face while we talked. When his image appeared on the screen, older, more mature, but still recognizably my child, I had to fight back tears. "You look different," he said, studying my face through the pixelated connection. "Older, sadder." "You look different too," I replied. "More like a man than a boy." We spent the first few minutes of the call just looking at each other, processing how much we both changed during our separation. The photo I kept in my cell was from Christmas 3 years ago. He'd been 15 then, still soft around the edges, still looking to me for guidance and approval. The young man on the screen was someone I barely recognized, someone who'd grown up without me. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about helping me figure out how to move forward instead of trying to maintain something that was broken. I think I'm ready to try to build something new." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had, raw, honest, painful, but ultimately healing. For the first time, my son felt free to express his anger without worrying about hurting my feelings or damaging our fragile connection. For the first time, I felt able to take responsibility for my actions without making excuses or deflecting blame. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice steady but intense. "When you were arrested, I didn't just lose my father. I lost my sense of reality. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about you, about our life, it was all built on lies. You weren't the successful businessman I thought you were. We weren't the secure, happy family I believed we were. Our whole life was funded by stolen money." I nodded, forcing myself to maintain eye contact even though every word felt like a physical blow. The new photo from our video call that he'd taken a screenshot of showed both of us in ways we'd never seen before him, confident and direct, me vulnerable and listening. "I grieve for the father I thought I had," he continued. "The man who taught me to throw a baseball, who helped me with my homework, who promised me that hard work and integrity would lead to success. That man never really existed, did he?" "He existed," I said quietly. "But he was flawed in ways I never let you see. The love was real, even if the foundation was rotten." "I know the love was real," he said. "That's what made it so hard. It would have been easier to hate you if I thought you didn't care about me, but I know you did care. I know you were trying to provide for me, to give me opportunities, to be a good father. I just wish you'd found a way to do that without destroying everything." We talked about his therapy sessions, about the coping mechanisms he'd developed, about the ways my incarceration had forced him to become independent and resilient in ways no teenager should have to. He told me about working nights at the restaurant, about helping his mother with bills, about making decisions about his future without any parental guidance. "Dr. Patterson helped me understand something important," he said. "She said that I'd been trying to grieve someone who wasn't actually dead, which was making it impossible to process my feelings properly. She said that in some ways, creating the lie about your death was my mind's way of trying to make sense of losing the father I thought I knew." The insight was profound and devastating. My son had been trying to mourn someone who was still alive, still calling him every week, still trying to maintain a relationship. No wonder he'd been struggling with panic attacks and anxiety. His psychological reality and his actual circumstances had been completely at odds. "I'm proud of who you've become," I told him, and I meant it. "I'm proud of your strength, your integrity, your ability to build a life despite everything I put you through." "I'm not proud of the lying," he said, "but I understand why I did it, and I'm proud of stopping. That's something, right?" "That's everything," I said. We made new promises to each other that day, not the naive promises of before, but realistic commitments based on who we actually were rather than who we wished we could be. I promised to stop trying to be the father I'd been before prison, to accept that our relationship would be different now. He promised to stop protecting me from the truth of how my actions had affected him. "I want to try visiting you," he said near the end of our call. "Not because I forgive you, not because everything's okay, but because I want to see if we can build something real from where we are now." "What would that look like?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think it starts with both of us accepting that the relationship we had before is gone forever. We can't go back to being the father and son we were when I was 15. But maybe we can figure out how to be the father and son we are now, with all the baggage and complications and hard truths that come with that. Independent and resilient in ways no teenager should have to." He told me about working nights at the restaurant, about helping his mother with bills, about making decisions about his future without any parental guidance. "I'm proud of who you've become," I told him, and I meant it. "I'm proud of your strength, your integrity, your ability to build a life despite everything I put you through." "I'm not proud of the lying," he said, "but I understand why I did it, and I'm proud of stopping. That's something, right?" "That's everything," I said. We made new promises to each other that day, not the naive promises of before, but realistic commitments based on who we actually were rather than who we wished we could be. I promised to stop trying to be the father I'd been before prison, to accept that our relationship would be different now. He promised to stop protecting me from the truth of how my actions had affected him. "I want to try visiting you," he said, near the end of our call. "Not because I forgive you, not because everything's okay, but because I want to see if we can build something real from where we are now." The college application essay my son shared with me during one of our calls was a revelation. Instead of the sanitized narrative about overcoming loss that he'd originally planned, he'd written something raw and honest about the complex process of loving someone who disappointed you beyond measure. "I want to read you part of it," he said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The prompt was about a time when you had to choose between loyalty and honesty. His essay began with the moment he'd learned about my crimes, then moved through his decision to create the lie about my death, and finally to his choice to tell the truth despite the personal cost. It was beautifully written, mature beyond his years, and brutally honest about the psychological toll of living with deception. "I learned that loyalty without honesty isn't really loyalty at all," he read. "It's just enabling. By lying about my father's situation, I thought I was protecting him and protecting myself. But really, I was preventing both of us from dealing with reality. True loyalty sometimes means accepting difficult truths and working to build something better from the wreckage." The essay concluded with his decision to reveal the truth to Riley and at school, framing it not as a betrayal of our family, but as the first step toward genuine healing. Several universities had already expressed interest in his application, drawn not to a story of victimhood, but to a narrative of active choice and moral courage. "My guidance counselor thinks this essay is stronger than the original one," he told me. "She says it shows real character development and self-reflection." Some of the schools specifically commented on my maturity and integrity. I felt a pride I hadn't experienced in years, not the shallow pride of material success, but the deep satisfaction of seeing my son become a person of genuine character despite the obstacles I placed in his path. "There's something else," he continued. "I've been accepted to state with a partial scholarship. It's not enough to cover everything, but with my job and some student loans, I can make it work. I'll be starting in the fall." The timeline hit me like a physical blow. Fall meant September, which was only 4 months away. My son would be leaving for college while I still had 8 months left on my sentence. I'd miss his graduation, his departure for school, the beginning of his adult life. "I want you to be involved in planning for college," he said, surprising me. "Not financially, I know you can't help with that, but I want your advice, your support. I want to share this experience with you, even if it's from a distance." We spent the next hour talking about his major, business, with a focus on ethics, his career goals. He wanted to work in nonprofit management, and his hopes for the future. For the first time in years, I felt like I was actually participating in my son's life rather than just observing it from the sidelines. I've been thinking about what kind of relationship we'll have when you get out, he said as our call time was running short. I don't think it will ever be the same as it was before. Too much has happened. Too much trust has been broken. But maybe it can be something different, more honest, more real. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know it starts with both of us accepting who we actually are instead of who we wish we were. You're not the perfect father I thought you were when I was a kid. I'm not the grateful, forgiving son you might want me to be. But maybe we can work with what's actually here instead of mourning what's lost. The wisdom in his words astounded me. At 18, my son had learned lessons about forgiveness and relationships that had taken me a lifetime to understand. He wasn't offering me absolution or pretending that our problems could be easily solved. Instead, he was proposing something harder and more valuable. The possibility of building an authentic relationship based on truth rather than fantasy. I'd like that, I said. I'd like to try to be the father you actually need instead of the father I think I should be. And I'll try to be the son I actually am instead of the son I think you want, he replied. No more pretending, no more lies. Just whatever's real between us, good and bad. Over the following weeks, our conversations became more frequent and more substantial. He started calling me twice a week instead of once, and our calls stretched longer as we explored topics we'd never discussed before. He told me about his fears regarding college, his complicated feelings about leaving his mother alone, his excitement about studying subjects that genuinely interested him. I've been thinking about declaring a double major, he said during one call, business and psychology. I want to understand both the practical side of running organizations and the human side of helping people through difficult situations. The combination made perfect sense given his experiences. He'd learned firsthand about the consequences of financial crimes and the psychological impact of family trauma. Now he wanted to use that knowledge to help others navigate similar challenges. Riley and I have been talking about doing long distance while I'm at college, he continued. She's got another year of high school left, but we want to try to make it work. Her parents have been really supportive, even offering to help her visit me at school. The fact that Riley's family continued to embrace him despite knowing the truth about our situation still amazed me. Their capacity for understanding and forgiveness had been a crucial part of his healing process. There's something else I want to tell you, he said, his voice growing more serious. I've started volunteering with a program that helps children of incarcerated parents. It's just a few hours a week, but it's been really meaningful. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. My son had taken his painful experience and transformed it into a way to help others facing similar challenges. What kind of work do you do with them? I asked. Mostly just listening, he said. A lot of these kids are dealing with the same shame and isolation I felt. Some of them have created their own lies and deceptions to cope. I try to help them see that there are other options, that the truth doesn't have to destroy their lives. I keep a calendar on my cell wall, now not to count down the days until my release, but to mark the milestones in my son's life that I'm participating in from afar. His graduation ceremony, which I watched via livestream in the prison library. His first day at his summer job, managing social media for a local nonprofit. His acceptance to college, which we celebrated during a special phone call that lasted an hour. The release date calendar I'd been keeping has evolved from a desperate countdown to something more meaningful, a visual reminder of the time I have left to become the kind of father my son deserves when I'm free. Each X I mark represents not just a day closer to release, but a day of growth, reflection, and preparation for the life I want to build on the outside. My son visits me now, not frequently, but regularly. Once a month, he makes the 2-hour drive to the prison and sits across from me in the visiting room, and we talk about real things. His fears about starting college, his complicated relationship with his mother, his ongoing therapy work, his growing relationship with Riley's family, who now know the truth about our situation. Riley's parents want to meet you when you get out, he told me during his last visit. Not right away, they understand that will take time. But eventually, they said they want to understand the whole story, including your perspective. The generosity of that offer overwhelmed me. These people had every right to feel betrayed and manipulated by our family's deception, but instead they were extending grace and curiosity. Riley's father had even written me a letter, thanking me for raising a son with enough integrity to eventually choose truth over comfort. I've been thinking about what I want to study in college, my son continued. I know I said business with a focus on ethics, but I'm also interested in criminal justice reform. Specifically, programs that help families of incarcerated people deal with the collateral consequences of incarceration. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to transform our painful experience into something that might help others. That sounds like important work. It is, he said. I've learned so much about how the justice system affects families, not just the people who commit crimes. There are thousands of kids like me, dealing with shame and isolation and complex grief. I want to help them find better ways to cope than creating elaborate lies. The transformation in my son over the past year has been remarkable. He's grown from a teenager hiding from reality into a young man actively engaging with difficult truths. His relationship with Riley has deepened now that it's based on honesty. His academic performance has improved now that he's not spending energy maintaining deceptions. His therapy work has progressed now that he's willing to process his actual experiences rather than fictional ones. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive you, he told me during one particularly honest conversation, but I've learned that forgiveness isn't something you achieve once and then you're done. It's something you choose repeatedly, based on how people behave going forward. That understanding has become the foundation of our rebuilding relationship. Instead of demanding forgiveness I haven't earned, I'm focusing on making choices every day that might eventually deserve it. I'm participating in every prison program available: financial literacy, anger management, victim impact classes. I'm preparing for re-entry by developing job skills and rebuilding professional relationships with former colleagues who are willing to give me a second chance. Most importantly, I'm learning to be honest with my son, with myself, and with the people I hurt through my crimes. I've written letters to my former clients, taking full responsibility for my actions and outlining the steps I'm taking to ensure I never put anyone in that position again. Some have responded with anger, others with surprising grace, but all have received the truth they deserved years ago. My son graduated last month as salutatorian of his class. In his graduation speech, he talked about the importance of choosing integrity over comfort, truth over convenience. He didn't mention me directly, but I knew the words were partly inspired by our journey together. Watching him walk across that Stagevale live stream, I felt a pride I'd never experienced, not pride in his achievements, which were entirely his own, but pride in his character, which had been forged in fires I'd accidentally set. When I'm released in 7 months, I don't know exactly what our relationship will look like. We're both different people than we were when this all began. But I know it will be built on a foundation of truth instead of pretense, acceptance instead of denial, and hope instead of desperation. If you found yourself in a situation where the people you love have had to choose between loyalty and honesty, I want you to know that healing is possible, but only if you're willing to face the truth about the pain you've caused and the work required to rebuild what's been broken. The easy path is to demand forgiveness and understanding. The harder path, the only path that actually leads somewhere better, is to earn them through consistent, honest action over time. Like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share your own experiences with healing fractured family relationships in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell the truth about our failures and our hope for something better. I keep a calendar on my cell wall, now not to count down the days until my release, but to mark the milestones in my son's life that I'm participating in from afar. His graduation ceremony, which I watched via live stream in the prison library. His first day at his summer job, managing social media for a local nonprofit. His acceptance to college, which we celebrated during a special phone call that lasted an hour. The release date calendar I've been keeping has evolved from a desperate countdown to something more meaningful, a visual reminder of the time I have left to become the kind of father my son deserves when I'm free. Each X I mark represents not just a day closer to release, but a day of growth, reflection, and preparation for the life I want to build on the outside. My son visits me, now not frequently, but regularly. Once a month, he makes the 2-hour drive to the prison and sits across from me in the visiting room, and we talk about real things. His fears about starting college, his complicated relationship with his mother, his ongoing therapy work, his growing relationship with Riley's family, who now know the truth about our situation. Riley's parents want to meet you when you get out, he told me during his last visit. Not right away, they understand that will take time, but eventually, they said they want to understand the whole story, including your perspective. The generosity of that offer overwhelmed me. These people had every right to feel betrayed and manipulated by our family's deception, but instead they were extending grace and curiosity. Riley's father had even written me a letter, thanking me for raising a son with enough integrity to eventually choose truth over comfort. I've been thinking about what I want to study in college, my son continued. I know I said business with a focus on ethics, but I'm also interested in criminal justice reform. Specifically, programs that help families of incarcerated people deal with the collateral consequences of incarceration. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to transform our painful experience into something that might help others. That sounds like important work. It is, he said. I've learned so much about how the justice system affects families, not just the people who commit crimes. There are thousands of kids like me, dealing with shame and isolation and complex grief. I want to help them find better ways to cope than creating elaborate lies. The transformation in my son over the past year has been remarkable. He's grown from a teenager hiding from reality into a young man actively engaging with difficult truths. His relationship with Riley has deepened now that it's based on honesty. His academic performance has improved now that he's not spending energy maintaining deceptions. His therapy work has progressed now that he's willing to process his actual experiences rather than fictional ones. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive you, he told me during one particularly honest conversation. But I've learned that forgiveness isn't something you achieve once and then you're done. It's something you choose repeatedly, based on how people behave going forward. That understanding has become the foundation of our rebuilding relationship. Instead of demanding forgiveness I haven't earned, I'm focusing on making choices every day that might eventually deserve it. I'm participating in every prison program available: financial literacy, anger management, victim impact classes. I'm preparing for re-entry by developing job skills and rebuilding professional relationships with former colleagues who are willing to give me a second chance. Most importantly, I'm learning to be honest with my son, with myself, and with the people I hurt through my crimes. I've written letters to my former clients, taking full responsibility for my actions and outlining the steps I'm taking to ensure I never put anyone in that position again. Some have responded with anger, others with surprising grace, but all have received the truth they deserved, years ago. My son graduated last month as salutatorian of his class. In his graduation speech, he talked about the importance of choosing integrity over comfort, truth over convenience. He didn't mention me directly, but I knew the words were partly inspired by our journey together. Watching him walk across that stage via live stream, I felt a pride I'd never experienced, not pride in his achievements, which were entirely his own, but pride in his character, which had been forged in fires I'd accidentally set. When I'm released in 7 months, I don't know exactly what our relationship will look like. We're both different people than we were when this all began. But I know it will be built on a foundation of truth instead of pretense, acceptance instead of denial, and hope instead of desperation. If you found yourself in a situation where the people you love have had to choose between loyalty and honesty, I want you to know that healing is possible, but only if you're willing to face the truth about the pain you've caused and the work required to rebuild what's been broken. The easy path is to demand forgiveness and understanding. The harder path, the only path that actually leads somewhere better, is to earn them through consistent, honest action over time. Like and subscribe if this story resonated with you. And share your own experiences with healing fractured family relationships in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply tell the truth about our failures and our hope for something better.